Hello, and welcome to the History of Philosophy in China by Peter Adamson and Karen Lai, brought to you with the support of the Philosophy Department at King's College London and the LMU in Munich. Online at historyofphilosophy.net. Today's episode, You Don't Say, the Tao That Cannot Be Told. As friends and family members of philosophers will be well aware, they do love to talk. There's a nice joke about this in a short story by Julian Barnes, which imagines that in heaven, everyone gets to do whatever they want. Eventually, people always decide they've had enough, and they choose to die for good. The ones who hang on the longest are, it turns out, the philosophers, since they are happy to spend century after century doing nothing but arguing with one another. Yet sometimes even philosophers decide they have to shut up. As Wittgenstein famously said, "Whereof one cannot speak, thereof one must be silent." And well before him, religiously inspired philosophical texts explored the idea that God transcends our ability to describe what this divine being might be. Many philosophers have suggested that the divine lies beyond human ken, from the late ancient Neoplatonists and medieval mystics, who argued that the right attitude to God would be to reside in a cloud of unknowing, to Descartes, who argued that God can make a square circle. After all, who are we to bind his omnipotence with our footling logic? Perhaps we need to accept that as humans we just aren't able to understand ideal forms or divine beings. In keeping with this, we also lack the words to express them. The very first line of the Lao Tzu seems to be suggesting something like this, when it says, "Tao that can be told is not an enduring Tao." That's a pretty puzzling, even unpromising start to a text that is meant to tell us about Tao. What exactly are we supposed to do with all the words that will follow if the true Tao cannot be told? Let's begin by saying a bit more about those words that follow. As we now have it, the Lao Tzu is an 81-chapter text whose chapters are short, ranging from around 6 to 20 lines. Many are presented as if in the form of poetry, so that some of the chapters can be organized in stanzas as if written to be recited. There is some suggestion that the writing of the Lao Tzu was preceded by an oral tradition of its recitation. As we saw last time, there were a few different versions of the Lao Tzu circulating during the Warring States period, yet more versions were generated with commentaries in the Han period and after. That might strike you as impertinent. How could someone just get hold of a copy of a text and modify it to suit their own purposes? Surely such blatant appropriation would have been objectionable. Well, not necessarily. To copy a text by hand was to edit or re-edit it. In some cases, the copyists made errors. In others, they decided that a certain understanding of a passage was preferable. And these copyists were most likely copying from another copied version. So in the Warring States period, there was no idea that just one particular version of a text was the original one intended by the author, as if there were a copyright for it. To say nothing of the fact that, as with other ancient texts we've considered, the oral tradition of the Lao Tzu preceded its written version. In fact, the existence of a large number of versions of a single text often indicates its popularity. By that metric, the Lao Tzu was an ancient bestseller. Different versions seem to have spread far and wide. The Lao Tzu also came to be known by another name, the Tao Te Ching. There are various speculations concerning when and how it acquired this new name. The new name is important, as the Lao Tzu is thereby assigned the status of a classic, or Jing. Its title literally means classic on Tao and De. You already sort of know what Tao means, and De may be rendered as virtuosity. One account of the origin of this name states that during the Han Dynasty, the Empress Dowager Do, a dedicated student of the Lao Tzu, gave it this elevated status. Another account, which doesn't necessarily contradict the first, associates the Lao Tzu with the beliefs of a religious order. Its founder, Zhang Daoling, claimed that Tao, in the person of Lao Tzu himself, had visited him and instructed him to establish an organization that reflected the order of the celestial spirits. With this powerful encouragement, Zhang Daoling undertook to investigate practices and texts, including the Lao Tzu, hence attributing it with scriptural authority by recognizing it as a classic or Jing. Likewise, the Shuangzi and the Leitzi were also given canonical or scriptural status. So it was called the Nanhua Xing, meaning the scripture of the southern flower, while the Liezi was called the Zhangxi Xianjing, the genuine scripture of overflowing emptiness. Southern flowers are pretty easy to imagine, but the phrase overflowing emptiness seems to make about as much sense as a square circle, which brings us back to the idea that Tao cannot be told. For Zhang Daoling and others, Tao was a spiritual ideal as well as a mystical form or mode of existence that transcends human comprehension. While the ideas and texts associated with religious practices are classified as belonging to the tradition of Dao Jiao, two received versions that have dominated studies in Taoist philosophy, or Dao Jia, are the He Xiang Gong and Wang Bi, which are commentary versions of the Lao Tzu, both believed to have the same line of transmission. The He Xiang Gong commentary was written in ordinary language, drawing out elements of religious practice and techniques for longevity, and was therefore more popular. By contrast, the Wang Bi commentary involved more critical discussions about the ideas and themes in the Lao Tzu and was not aligned with the views of any religious sect. Therefore, it lends itself more readily to philosophical analysis. Apart from the conception of Tao as spiritual ideal, another interpretation recognizes it as an all-embracing first principle. This is how the modern scholar Feng Yulang characterized the conception of Tao in the opening statement of the Lao Tzu. Feng's views on Chinese philosophy have been influential in the English-speaking world, especially as his 2-volume History of Chinese Philosophy was among the earliest English-language surveys of Chinese intellectual history, covering the topic from ancient times right down to the 20th century. In describing Tao in the Lao Tzu, Feng contrasts Tao with universals, which, he says, lie beyond shapes and features, yet they are not unnameable. Feng says that Tao is unnameable because it is not an individual thing, and so it is difficult to designate it by such a name as would be used to designate an object having individual existence. This is because all names have a power of limitation and determination. Having undertaken and completed his doctoral studies at Columbia University in the early 20th century, Feng was interested in the relationship between Chinese thought and Western philosophy. He would often compare and contrast Chinese terms to parallel ideas in Western philosophy, though this also meant that some of his explanations of Chinese philosophy uncritically applied concepts and themes from Western philosophy. For example, Feng explains the idea of Tao using the pair of words being, yu, and non-being, in the sense of existence and non-existence. Thus, he refers to Lao Tzu 40, which says, all things arise from being, and being arises from non-being. For Feng, this means that being refers to a thing's present existence, and non-being to an earlier time when the thing did not exist. Accordingly, Feng says that since Tao is not an object that can presently exist, we should say that it is non-being. On the other hand, he also says that because Tao is what has brought the universe into being, it is being in another, perhaps more fundamental sense. It seems that Feng attempts to draw together his view of Tao as first principle with questions about existence, but does not quite make it clear how these dimensions of Tao interrelate. A third conception of Tao gives it the fundamental role in an origination story. In contrast to Feng's view of Tao as principle, Tao is here understood as key to Taoist cosmogony, that is, an account of the origin of all things. The account is found in another Taoist text, the Taiyi Sheng Sui, meaning the great unity gives birth to water. Excavated at Guojian and attached to a version of the Lao Tzu, it is one of the most detailed cosmogonies before the Han period. Great unity, or Taiyi, is the name of a deity who is said to give rise to things. Scholars believe that Taiyi is also another name of Tao. Of course, the Tao is supposed to be nameless, but having gotten this far, one more paradox shouldn't discourage us. The origination story says, the great unity gives birth to water, and water returns to join with the great unity, thereby forming heaven. Heaven returns to join with the great unity, thereby forming earth. Heaven and earth further join with each other, thereby forming the spiritual and luminous. The spiritual and luminous further join with each other, thereby forming yin and yang. Yin and yang further join with each other, thereby forming cold and heat. Cold and heat further join with each other, thereby forming wet and dry. Wet and dry further join with each other, and the process comes to rest at the formation of the year. Tao's role in the generation of the cosmos is multi-layered. It may refer to material existence, but it may also be taken as a conceptual framework that grounds all existence in a single origination. Its understanding of life continues to unfold with webs of interdependence, such as between heaven and earth and yin and yang, in joint action. Closely associated with Tao as origination is still a fourth conception of Tao, Tao as sustenance for all things. The Lao Tzu expresses its conception of all things, meaning all beings, entities, and forces, with the term Wan Wu. Wan Wu literally means 10,000 things, but functions as a set phrase simply referring to the whole world as we know it, which last time we counted actually contains more than 10,000 things. Tao's role as sustenance is powerfully illustrated by a comparison with water, as in the line, Tao is to the world as the river and the sea are to rivulets and streams. This watery imagery comes up a lot in both the Lao Tzu and the Shuangzi, and has other connotations as well. For example, water flows and thus constantly changes, so that the one who understands Tao may be compared to a skillful swimmer who knows how to go with the current. But the fact that plants and animals depend so fundamentally on water means that allusions to rivers and the like may also naturally be understood to refer to Tao as a source of nourishment. As you might remember, the first episode of this series also went through different possible senses of Tao. Then we talked about Tao as a destination, Tao as an open-ended journey, and Tao as a method to achieve a goal. This was meant to introduce you to Warring States philosophy as a whole. The four meanings of Tao we've just discussed now are more distinctive of Tao and Taoist philosophy, and they all have to do with the nature of existence. Tao has appeared as a spiritual ideal or divinity, as a principle that governs the existence of all things, as a principle of origination, and as a source of sustenance. Which is not to say that these four conceptions are inconsistent or incompatible, though all may plausibly be associated with passages found in the Lao Tzu and associated texts. It's not as if any of these conceptions is worked through in any detail. Rather, they are interpretations of what Tao could mean in light of the textual evidence. Alongside these broadly metaphysical approaches to Tao in the Lao Tzu, there is a very different way to understand it, namely as a discourse or a way of communicating. Of course, there are lots of ways to communicate, including gestures, actions, silences, patterns of behavior, and so on. But speech, or yan, is a particular concern in the Lao Tzu. This word appears in 18 of its 81 chapters. Chapter 43 speaks about wordless teaching, while chapter 56 says, "He who knows does not speak, and he who speaks does not know." Of course, the authors of the Lao Tzu were not alone among Warring States thinkers in being fascinated by language. We saw how the Moist canons offered strategies to make sure that words are used to pick out the same things each time. For them, it is vital that everyone can effectively understand and implement the same standards. Collectively, this would reduce confusion and thus help to establish social order, one of the three primary goals of their ethics and political philosophy. These views about the importance of language were shared by the Confucians as well. The Xunzi includes an entire chapter on the rectification of names, a measure taken by the ruler to determine certain normative standards, such as correct behaviors, practices, and roles, so that the people could live by them. Beyond the literal use of words, though, the Confucians saw the practices we live by and that guide our interactions, such as how to show respect to an elder or how to say thank you, as forms of communication and social coordination. The scholar Li Chenyang proposes that Confucian Li, ritual propriety, functions as a cultural grammar. For the Confucians, ritual propriety helps us to become benevolent, ren, and conversely, those who are benevolent embody ritual propriety. So, we may understand Confucian Li as a kind of social glue, much as speaking the same language helps us bond with others. The competent use of cultural grammar shows itself in frictionless interaction with others, while conflict and misunderstanding result from communication breakdown. Just as you might fail to get where you're going if you have to ask for directions in a language other than your own, so in a foreign culture you might have difficulty navigating even the most minor social encounters, like trying to shake someone's hand when you are expected to bow to them. And this, the power of language to shape and control people, is precisely what the various Taoist texts are concerned about. Lao Tzu chapter 12 warns that seeming competency in language may actually hinder us from negotiating the world successfully. It uses the example of learning 5 color terms, 5 musical tone names, and 5 words for flavor. The 5 colors cause one's eyes to be blind. The 5 tones cause one's ears to be deaf. The 5 flavors cause one's palate to be spoiled. It's no coincidence that there are 5 terms in each list, because 5 was a favorite number among the early Chinese. There were, for instance, also the 5 elements, as they are commonly known, although 5 phases is a better translation, namely wood, fire, earth, metal, and water. You'll recall the Mengzi's list of 5 significant types of relationships, and there's a text in the Guodian corpus called the 5 conducts. Clearly, the short lists, which could so conveniently be ticked off on the fingers of one hand, seemed useful and even insightful. But the Lao Tzu warns against them, and more broadly, against conventional expectations about what we learn and how we navigate our world. When we learn the 5 tones, instead of the set of 5 enhancing our listening, it affects us as if we were deaf. The point of the passage is that when someone learns the 5 tones, they are learning to understand tones in the ways they are expected to do, just like their teachers, musicians, and singers before them have done. But what happens when we encounter a 6th or a 7th tone? We might think the answer lies in having more words for tones, flavors, and colors, but that's not the Lao Tzu's point. His concern is that no matter how extensive our categories and distinctions are, we will never find enough words to cover all the possible situations in the world. To learn a system for categorizing the world forces us to see the world in light of that system. Learning ritual propriety in order to become a benevolent person within the Confucian program means that we are steeped in the culture celebrated by the Confucians. And that was very much the point, which is why the Analects even tells us how Kongzi walked, ate, and slept. This will help us to orient ourselves according to its norms, to see the world in a Confucian way and navigate through it as a Confucian would do. A scholar of Taoism named Chad Hansen explains that from the Taoist contrasting point of view, when we learn to use words and to make distinctions, say, between benevolent and not benevolent, or between beautiful and ugly, we internalize society's preferences. Learning names shapes our behavioral attitudes, our desires. This is because we learn names by mimicking their use in guiding choices in ordinary contexts. Hence, we learn to let names guide us to make the same choices that our social models do. Our learning consists in daily increasing our mastery of the system of names. Language is a tool in society's project of shaping our behavioral motivations. The paradoxically blinding nature of education is that it turns our attention to one set of values and blinds us to all other possibilities. The problem, as the Taoists saw it, is that if we adopt a single set of standards, perpetuated by elders, teachers, grandparents, parents, aunts, and uncles, and eventually by ourselves to our own children, we might miss seeing the deeper, dynamic relationalities between aspects of the world. So, when we promote a particular Tao as a way of life or as a discourse, we primarily close off other options. This is another reason why the Tao cannot be told, because to tell it in any particular way is to foreclose all the other ways of telling it. This fear may have seemed particularly relevant in the Warring States period, given the high stakes of an unsettled and violent time, combined with the strict and stridently held codes of conduct being put forward by the Confucians, Mohists, and others. They were not saying, well, here's one way you might try to cope among others. They were defending their way as the only way and polemicizing against everyone else. Of course, people today may likewise be intolerant, showing nothing but scorn for views that don't align with their own. So we may understand Taoist philosophy as offering a different and unique conception of Tao as compared with other traditions. It doesn't just articulate a different view of its own, but claims to sit above all the other views, surveying as if from a height the negative impacts of these other views. Thus, the Taoist advocates against promoting yet another Tao. In that spirit, let us return to the opening phrase of the Lao Tzu and acknowledge that there may be more than one way to understand it. We offered the translation, Tao that can be told is not an enduring Tao. The difficulties begin even before the first word. We have said simply Tao rather than the Tao or a Tao, as would be more natural in English. The Chinese has no article, whether definite or indefinite, so there's nothing in the original text to help us choose between the Tao, a Tao, or no article at all. And these choices would have philosophical implications. For instance, if you say the Tao, that strongly implies that there's only one Tao. And there's another problem. In the forms of ancient Chinese we see in Warring States texts, no punctuation was used. This means that working out strings of words that form phrases or sentences can sometimes be quite tricky. The Lao Tzu's opening phrase comprises only 6 Chinese characters. Dao ke dao, fei chang dao, which corresponds to Dao, possibly, told, not, enduring Dao. This phrase is often interpreted in a way that gives weight to the enduring Dao. In other words, there are 2 versions of Dao, and the enduring Dao is the one the Lao Tzu upholds. The other one, the Dao that can be told, is rejected or at least put firmly in an inferior place. Having adopted this interpretation, one would then need to go on to speculate as to what the enduring Dao might be. As we've seen, options would include Lao Tzu himself, the source of the 10,000 things, the sustainer of all life, and so on. In any case, this enduring Dao would be ineffable. It cannot be told. But what if we were to place the emphasis on the Dao that can be told? Nothing in the 6-character phrase tells us that the Lao Tzu advocates for the enduring Dao over that which can be told. If we understand the Lao Tzu's focus to be on the Dao that can be told, we may understand the phrase as saying this: of the Daos that may be told, none of them are enduring Daos. There is no permanence or superiority in any of the Daos that are told, for instance by rival thinkers like the Confucians. These rivals all believe that their own Daos are enduring, but they are wrong. So in this interpretation, the point is not to praise some one enduring Dao. Rather, it is just a negative or critical remark. No one who speaks of Dao should assume that their proposal is the only correct one, to be implemented prescriptively as a guiding discourse for all. The Lao Tzu would admit that the Daos that can be told are all we've got to work with, and would recommend that we proceed without an absolute objective guiding plan that covers everyone for all time. These 2 interpretations of the opening line of the Lao Tzu could not be more different. While the first emphasizes an enduring Dao that lies beyond human attempts to capture it in words, the second advises us not to yearn after some concocted vision that holds over us all. And there might be significant advantage in taking the opening statement of the Lao Tzu in that second non-orthodox way. The first orthodox interpretation creates a paradox concerning the text itself. If the Lao Tzu holds that all the Daos told by humans are not enduring Daos, why wouldn't that be true of the Lao Tzu's own Dao? By contrast, if we take it that the opening line of the Lao Tzu is saying that there are no enduring Daos, and let no one assume theirs is the one, we may easily do away with the paradox of the Lao Tzu saying something that, it tells its readers, cannot be said. On either interpretation, we are drawn into Lao Tzu's concern about language, about its power, about what it says, and about what it cannot say. But there's a lot more to Taoism and the Lao Tzu than concern with language. Even if the opening remark does not point us towards an enduring cosmological principle, there's no denying that the Lao Tzu is deeply interested in the cosmos. It wants to help us understand and navigate the natural world, as well as the social world. We'll be making our way to that topic next time, as we turn to Taoism and nature, here on the History of Philosophy in China.